to my Mosaic family for the warm reception. I tell you, if I'm down, I'm not down when I come to Mosaic. It is a joy and a privilege to be in your company and to see so many faces that I know and love and recognize, and so many new faces that I know not of. But I am grateful that you're in this space. Listen, I wish to God that this were around when I was doing my MDiv program. You have no idea the enormous gift this is to your future ministry and to your life. So whatever you do through the course of your week, let me encourage you to keep this meeting a top priority, regardless of whatever's going on in your schedule. It's just going to make you a more well-rounded spiritual leader when you get out of here. What's up, Sinclair? Dr. Cha hates it when I say this, and I'm not blaspheming. There is no fourth person of the Trinity. But he's the closest thing to someone who carries that kind of profound grace to all of us. I've learned so much about him. He's kind of like Yoda, too. You know, I don't know if y'all watched those things. He has like deep wisdom sayings that hit you days after you've left him. It's like, wait a minute, that was really profound. And so, Dr. Cha, bless you, man, for the ways in which you have loved on us and raised whole generations to be better Christians, leaders and fathers and husbands, man. Thank you for that. And the whole list goes on. There's Danny Hartman, who's carrying on the legacy in wonderful ways, and Dr. Dana Harris, who saw me through Suicide Greek in the summer of 2002, a significant portion of that. And she did it with such love and grace while the rest of us were dying. And that class was like Monday through Saturday, I think, wasn't it? Yeah, it was like Monday through Saturday from like 9 in the morning to 9 at night or something. It was something terrible. But I still, to this day, know what a genitive of source is, you know? And I know the difference between a nominative and an accusative noun, and I recognize the dative as I'm going through, and all of that. Whatever good comes out of my handling of the original text in the New Testament is tethered to your ministry, and I want to say thank you so much for that. All right, so I'm just going to start talking, and I'm going to stop when my time is done. Danny and I have had a conversation, and so I am going to hopefully hit on exactly what we talked about. And if not, just know my schedule's real busy, and we'll try it again another time. All right. So I have the remarkable privilege. I don't know what has happened to my schedule and my life here recently. Kirsty and I talk about just an explosion in one sense of things all around. And so it lands me in some very interesting spaces. Here I am, a graduate, a black man from a predominantly white evangelical institution, a Swedish white evangelical institution, serving in full-time ministry by the grace of God in Chicago. And this fall, between, and I won't name the schools, but from the north to the south, in some very progressive, but some might even call them liberal academies, main stage, to some very conservative, some might call them, academies, and churches all in between. And when I say conservative, I don't mean like Bob Jones in South Carolina. I ain't there. Maybe y'all don't want to invite me there either. I haven't been there. But some names that you would recognize. And around the subject of preaching and the church's engagement with cultural and societal issues in preaching, both to, my assignments have been, both to model that kind of preaching and to explain the origins of that preaching and the methodology behind that preaching. And the receptions are strikingly dissimilar in some ways, and they are profoundly and strikingly similar in other ways. I read some audiences going, they are absolutely going to kick me out of here as soon as my sermon is over. Only to discover that people are actually like standing and clapping, and some are crying, because this word has that power. It doesn't matter what context you label yourself in. When the lion is unleashed, people cannot fight it. In settings where people don't agree with with some of the practices that are borne out in ministry from our preaching. But when we're done, can't deny where we got it from. And here's what I'm observing that I want to issue to you as a warning and as a caution. I have been just even this year in some spaces that demonstrate the wide spectrum of Christian preaching and Christian ministry. On the one hand, there are some settings that are so horizontal that they have made of the gospel a kind of civic organization that really, in one sense, is no more glorious than the NAACP or the Urban League. All good work, all trying to tear down misogyny and toxic patriarchy and trying to elevate the equality of persons made in the image of God, but have lost their moorings. The foundations are gone. The shifting goes with the wind, because in their quest to move culture along through the church and their preaching, they've abandoned the central tenet of our preaching. It's so horizontal, you don't recognize anything vertical in it anymore. And the challenge with that is that your greatest allies become antagonists of the gospel. When preaching for change and for justice and for doing what's right trumps an honest investigation of the truth of the passage, your greatest allies become antagonists of the gospel. And then you're just on a clock. I preach with the clock every Sunday, and when it gets down about 9 minutes, I know I'm in trouble because I'm not halfway through my sermon. And that's the clock that the church is on when it over-identifies with a horizontal gospel. It's about to be done and doesn't even know it. It's striking because, and I didn't plan to go here, in one sense, that may be the story of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton that were at one point, and the University of Chicago for that matter, were at one point people who held to what we would consider to be an orthodox preaching of the gospel, but they don't even identify. You couldn't even tell what that is there in those spaces anymore. So that's one side of the spectrum. Are you with me? So tied to social construction and deconstruction that they have made of the gospel a civic organization or a civic proclamation for civic organizations. But then there are other places I go. I've been to this year, and I'm on my way to some others. Don't follow me on Instagram. Where there is such a vertical proclamation of the truth of God's interaction with the world and our salvation story. The soteriology is so prominent that it's void of any kind of anthropology. There is no application beyond salvation. And so you are a heretic if you see any kind of socialization or social application in the gospel. And so my cry in those spaces is that we don't need to socialize the gospel. That's true. But we do need to gospelize the social. We are not preaching a full redemptive historical narrative if all of creation is left out of the redemptive story. If the totality of creation, as Paul says in Romans 8, that groans is somehow left out of the narrative. And so I think it was Mother Teresa who said, to dwell above with the saints I love, that would be glory. To dwell below with the saints I know, that's another story. She leaned into this line that said, some of us are so heavenly minded that we are of no earthly good. And so the challenge with that I see is very talented, very astute, well-educated, passionate seminary graduates leave the academy, and they become, after a time, disgruntled with the church, frustrated with the church's lack of progress, and they abandon the church in one sense altogether. You may not see it much at Trinity or with many Trinity grads, but I can tell you from my perch and from some of my travel around the country, it's happening. That we get so refined that we live on either side of those spectrums that we end up just not going to church at all. And I remember, he's a blessed memory now, Dr. Grant Osborne told us that would happen. He said one night in our New Testament class, I believe it was on Acts and the epistolary literature, he said rather prophetically that a number of us, a percentage of us, imagine your professor saying this to you, a percentage of us in his class that night would not last in ministry 10 years post-graduation. And he would tell us, but because the social realities, the actual context within which the church lives is not academic. And he warned us against a kind of false arrogance that would make all of our investigation about the holes in the church and holes in theology, it would make us a kind of condescending group of preachers. And he was right. There were some in that class who now are no longer involved in the life of a local church. So it's rough to follow some of the people you went to seminary with on Instagram and find out what they're doing on Sunday morning. It's not engaging the local church. And so they say, I wish I could show this to you as I make my way through a kind of methodology myself. It's not a meme on social media. It's actually a video. It's a little black boy in a church standing up at the choir loft, and they give him a mic. And say, oh, it's so encouraging too. It's so encouraging. I know this thing. Oh, talk, baby, say something, And little boy gets the microphone. He grabs the microphone. And he goes, I'm tired of this church. And he hands the mic over. You should pull it up. It's like there. It's legit. And it's gotten so much love and so many shares on social media because people identify with that. And then as he's walking back, you can hear the people, oh my Lord. You hear the old church mothers, is that what you got to say? And he meant it, and maybe he's 7, I don't know. He meant it in his young heart. That's a real sentiment from a lot of people these days. They love God. That's a trap music way of saying they love God. They love God, but they don't like the church. In a word, it's what Pastor James Meeks would call decorpulation. It is a fascination, and not to be hyperbolic in my speech, but it is a fascination with the head to the exclusion of the body. It is I will take the head, but I won't take the body. That's problematic because Christ came to redeem a church, and he is coming back for a church without spot or wrinkle. He's not coming back for the Urban League. He's not coming back for the ACLU. He's not coming back for the ERLC. He ain't even coming back for TEDS. He's coming back for the church. Flaws and all. Though she will be without spot or wrinkle. But Beyonce said flaws and all. It is this. No matter how ugly the church is, she still is Christ's bride. No matter how she might at times misrepresent her origin, she's worth sticking with. Because she is the only local agency through which God brings transformation in the world. Our Lord told Peter, upon this rock, I'll build my church. He didn't say I'll build all these other things. Upon this rock, I'll build my church. And the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So in our last few moments together, let me walk through what I think is a responsible homiletic, maybe even a responsible hermeneutic first, for those who are reconciled to be reconcilers, to steward the pulpit in a way that helps your church to meaningfully engage societal issues while keeping the gospel at the center. All right? One of the things I love about this is that when I was in divinity school, man, I used to, some of the highlights for me is when pastors who were active in the community came in, talk about the stuff they were seeing on the grounds. It was like war soldiers who would come in and they lay their equipment down and they sit there and go, I'm wounded, but it's a good fight going on out there and can't wait for y'all to jump in there with us. And so I come to you today kind of with that. Our church next year, Lord willing, will open, check this, Dr. Cha, will open the Progressive Center for Counseling and Justice. It is a little shanty we bought 2 blocks south of the church. It's separated from the church. One of the reasons it's separated from the church is because at least some of the data shows that chocolate people don't like being visible when they go to counseling. And so we didn't connect it to the church. It's separate from it. You could walk to it in the neighborhood. You could pull your car up. You could be incognito as you walk up to the center itself. All right. So licensed professional Christian counselors will serve our community in this regard. And we do have a need for this. We have a number of children who are struggling with PTSD, not because they've been to war, but because they live in a virtual war zone. When you've seen friends murdered, we have a man who attends our church. He's not a member, but he comes, and his son, who was doing very well in school, just started failing all of his classes all of a sudden. Became very disrespectful at home. And they could not figure out why. And one day, they actually had to call the police to intervene at their home. And one of the cops recognized what was going on with the kid, asked to speak to the kid personally, and said, tell me what you've seen. I've been to war. Everything you're describing sounds exactly what I've been doing. He hadn't been able to sleep, suffering from nightmares, hadn't been able to keep down food. And no wonder he was failing in class. Turns out he witnessed his friend get murdered at point blank range. He's in high school. And doesn't know where to go, where to turn. Believe it or not, we've got a number of young people who are struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. And what we want to do, if God shall give us the grace, is to open a center where young people like that can find help and hope in some real integrative counseling sessions. But not only that, we've got domestic issues, we've got crisis pregnancy, we got people who just need help. And the Sunday sermon is going to help them, but they need to sit down with somebody and talk through those issues. And so you can pray with us on that end. Then the other side of it is a justice center. We have great needs in the life of our community that we want to enable the community to turn around and organize to meet those needs, so that the church is not per se doing everything for the community, but that we lock arms with the community and help to bring valuable resources that the community says and recognizes that it needs. And so we will offer free legal counseling and all that kind of stuff. We are seeking to become a satellite expungement center for the city, so that you can, if you got a record, instead of getting to City Hall on those particular dates, you can turn in your paperwork at this center. But how do we do that, and why do we do that? We do that because I think it's a gospel imperative. We don't do it in lieu of the gospel. We do it because of the gospel. So I'm writing a book right now for IVP. I'm so far behind. You guys, I really appreciate your prayers. I'm not saying that at all. So I know y'all like to pray for people when we're done. That's my number one prayer request, that they don't fire me because I'm so far behind on this thing. But the Old Testament verbiage for justice, the primary word is the word mishpat, which you know is divinely righteous action. But the weird part about it, although it's divinely righteous action, it can be done by human beings. It's almost a communicable attribute of God. It is one of the ways in which we can carry out the heart of God in the world, is to do justice. And then one of the consequences of mishpat is shalom. It is that peace comes. I like the way that Brian Stevenson wrote it in his book, Just Mercy. He said it's something like I may mess it up, but the opposite of poverty is justice. In one sense is the way that he said it. Not in the sense that the poor we won't have with us always, but that when justice is done, people are able to live in peace. And so you get the feeling from reading the Old Testament that justice is not just something that God does, but it's something that humanity is supposed to do, but it is born out of the mind of God. And so do your homework too. You will see this. Tzedakah is the word for righteousness in the Old Testament. It is the quality, the state, and the characteristic of being right. It is generally speaking, when in relation to God, the idea of righteousness in a moral state. And there are so many ways in which it plays out. I mean, between the kings and the prophets and the people, there is this idea that there is right and wrong. And when you get right, you can achieve a moral state. Not just simply an individual moral state, but you can achieve a kind of communal moral state. And so there's a quality, almost a tangible quality, that comes to this. It is the absence of bias and self-interest and deception. It's the absence of the godless being in authority. That's the idea of righteousness in a real sense, and justice as they come together, the quality of them as they meet, as they kiss, as the psalmist says in the Old Testament. And so the question becomes, what is the church supposed to do with that, and how does that work its way out in our preaching? So I'll give you one example, and then we'll move on to the New Testament piece, and then I'll be done. How am I doing on time? Okay. So I'm preaching Psalm 51 the other week, right? One of our great psalms, where David is crying, "Lord, have mercy on me, for I have sinned." You almost can see the Jimmy Swaggart face on David. I have sinned. He's so broken by his sin. And when he gets to verse 4, he says, "Against you, you only, I have sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified when you speak and blameless when you judge." There's so much richness here, but I'm just trying to work my way through the original language. And as I'm rubbing my fingers across this passage, there are things that are jumping out at me. And one of them is the absence of what some would call horizontal sin, or the swallowing of a kind of horizontal sin in the acknowledgement of a vertical offense. David says, against you and you only have I sinned. That's problematic. Because it seemed to me like David sinned against Bathsheba. This woman's life is forever changed and not for the better. Like she is not in here going, all of a sudden I'm a queen, I get to live in the palace with King David. No, this joker killed her husband, changed her life, and then she had another baby who ends up becoming a rather remarkable figure. That's the grace of God, named Solomon. But her world is changing. So I'm wondering when I read this text, David, what do you mean? Against you and you only have I sinned. What about Uriah? My man is dead. And he was so loyal when he came home off the battlefield. He ain't even go home to sleep with his wife. He slept at the front porch, even after he got him on the 5th of Hennessy. What about Ahithophel, David's secretary of war, relative to Bathsheba? How would you like to show up for work the next day knowing your boss tipped off your granddaughter and killed her husband? So against you and you only have I sinned. What does that mean? I think what David is getting at here is when we sin against others, we are sinning against God. This does not absolve us of recognizing our sin against others, but it is saying that it is just that serious. So while I'm preaching, the force of social application jumps out. I don't think, Dr. Netland, it's a stretch to pull from this passage and to say there are a lot of crimes we have thought we've gotten away with because we committed them against others. But God has taken note of it personally. And by we, I mean the church. And the church in America has been so complicit in this American enterprise, these yet to be United States, in injustice upon injustice. But we call the church to repentance. We don't divorce the church. We don't file papers and break up with the church. No, we do what David did. We come back and say, Lord, you justify when you speak against us. One way, carry on. I was preaching for Mother's Day this year. What a beautiful day to preach, by the way. Manuela wasn't available. She was preaching at another church, and so I had to preach Mother's Day. And so I stood up and I looked at the passage of Moses' mother, who gets an edict from Pharaoh that all the boys are supposed to die. Do y'all hear this? Pharaoh, egomaniacal, tyrannical, none of these boys will live. Why he didn't pick the girls, I don't know. But Dr. Kwanja Njufu would say to us that if boys can't read by the time they're in the 3rd grade, they're prepped for prison already. He picks the boys. And what Moses' mother does is the text, I love the way it says, she let the Hebrew midwives, they let the boys live. And Moses' mom knows she can't hide them forever, so she builds a little bassinet. But the way that the bassinet is described in the original language is the same word used to describe Noah's Ark. She knows that she's going to put him in the crocodile-infested Nile, but she builds an ark around him. Yep, y'all looking at me the same way the church did at first when I got to it. That'll preach. State-sanctioned violence. Kill the boys. She says, I can't kill my boy. But since I got to send him out into the crocodile-infested Nile, I heard about this before. God saved people through an ark. What I'll do is I'll build an ark. And I'll entrust my baby to God, giving him all he needs around him that I can provide and let God handle the rest. Friends, there is a call from the church, from the pulpit of the local church, to parents in the church. We cannot stop all of the state-sanctioned violence. I want y'all to hear me. If you think that graduating seminary and you having a prophetic preaching ministry or being able to carry the gospel is going to stop all of the foolishness in the world, you've misread the Bible. You're not going to stop it all. I mean, the guy in the White House might get elected again next year. And some of y'all may have voted for him, so you might not like what I'm about to say, but oh well. He might get elected again next year. We're not going to be able to stop all of the shame and the terror that's happened. And by the way, if you think I'm biased, the previous guy in the White House, who's, we've had a chance to meet and share fellowship once or twice, he didn't fix it all either. In fact, some things were left worse than when he went in. But if you put all of your hope in this system and think that your work is going to change all of this, you're sadly mistaken. But what we can do is build arcs. What we can do is work against the grain. And isn't it amazing that God raised up a deliverer who was crying in an ark? And then he used the state to pay for his education. That's preaching. No, I'm serious. That's helping people to identify themselves in the context of the narrative. Not absolving responsibility or guilt, but in the prophetic tradition, warning of danger, pronouncing judgment, but proclaiming hope fundamentally at the end. I'm raising my voice. I'm getting excited. Let me calm down. I'm just talking to y'all. I'm done. When you get to the New Testament, you know already that the words for justice and righteousness share a cognate. You know that already. And you know that Paul, in some regards, uses those words interchangeably in varying forms. That there is a sense in which, in the mind of God, those things have never been separated. And so as you preach, preaching changes things. It does. But because when you stand on the authority of the word, it carries a certain weight. So as you preach, let the natural nuances of the passage that speak to communal life and to what's right and the justice emerge, even when it runs against the grain of your political preference. And I say that as a man who did not vote for Donald Trump. For whatever reason, I don't think he's the savior of the nation. But I cannot be so tied up in one political party that I'm not able to critique either one of them. The moment you see me on Fox News, come get me, Dr. Cha. Rallying and campaigning, being too in the pocket of either or. Let the gospel speak and let it give you hope. And ultimately, finally, what you tell the church is, we're the only enterprise that's going to live forever. We're the only family going into eternity. So let's do the best we can with what we have and watch the gospel win people to the Lord as it fixes systems, knowing that only the Lord ultimately is going to make right of all of these wrongs. All right, I've gone too long, and I didn't even get to all the rest of my method, but I'm going to stop here because we're going to go in a little while, and we got two questions that are going to be on the screen that we'll pause now to answer at our tables. One question centers around being too horizontal or too vertical, and really what I hope is that you won't use these questions as a window, but you'll use them as a mirror, so that even as you study and you work your way through your theology classes and your praxis, that you will in class go, in what ways is this both vertical and horizontal? And the second is, what should be a prerequisite and a consequence of biblical preaching in the area of reconciliation? And this is what I didn't get to, so let me give it to you now. In all of our preaching, and Emanuela can testify to this, and others, Sinclair can testify to this, we don't deviate from the authority of the text. We like wholeheartedly affirm that. So then when the text calls us to do something, we don't deviate from the authority that God has in his word. And so there are some presumptions that I say to our church when it comes to the preaching moment. If you want something other than this, you got to go to another church. I want y'all to come, but this is where you're going to get. And then as a result, there are things that are borne out. Let's take a few moments and answer those questions.